want to tell you a story about a boy named Dong-wook Shin. Um, the information about Dong-wook Shin comes from Anne Bellamy, who wrote a little article on him. Uh, Don, he's now a junior in high school. But when he was 5 years old, he was doing long division in his head. He began learning calculus in the fifth grade. He took advanced placement test on calculus and some of the most difficult advanced placement tests in seventh grade, and then proceeded to teach himself the curriculum to 7 other advanced placement math and science courses over the next 3 years. By the end of his 10th grade, he'd done so well with all those advanced placement tests that he was named the Siemens Award winner for having the highest scoring in the state of California. But Dong-wook's advanced placement test scores is just part of the story. It's part of a story about figuring out if a child is gifted and what to do in response to that gifting. The story of Dong-wook Shin is the story of a community of family and teachers that decided that when Don was still at a very young age and exhibiting these exceptional skills, to allow him to still have a childhood. He could have gone to college and studied math after the 7th grade. But the community wanted to give him a chance to grow up amongst his peers and to become a well-rounded individual. And they seem to have succeeded. He's in high school, he plays volleyball, he does academic decathlons, he serves as an officer on the speech and debate team. Like a lot of people have commented, to just see him, you wouldn't know that he's a stereotypical genius. He likes to play with his friends, he likes to joke around, he's able to take a joke and make a joke and have everyone laugh. He's one of a kind. And yet he's not. Because he has these exceptional skills, that exceptional gifting in mathematics. It all started when he was in kindergarten. And the teachers began to realize that there was something unique about Dong-wook. It became very clear very quickly that he had a gift and ability far above his age, his teacher from kindergarten said. It was in math that we began to see something in his face, the wheels turning. And so they decided to have a little fun. While his peers were working in small groups, they were practicing their adding and subtracting, the teacher started throwing out long division with 3-digit numbers, and he did them in his head. And the teacher would sit next to him and could just see that he did it in his head. And then he wrote it down afterwards. And it was so shocking. It was so exciting to see this. And that's just one example of how it takes just a moment of observation to discover a student's talents and gifts. And then from that point, it takes deliberate steps to nurture that gift, and yet to allow the child to have the best possible childhood they can have while maximizing those gifts. That is what this week's lessons are about. Identifying gifted students, recognizing what we can do for them. This week we will be going over an introduction for exceptional learners. Exceptional learners included both exceptionally gifted and talented students, as well as those students that have struggles with different ways of learning. This week, though, we're going to focus primarily upon gifted education. And so when we think about gifted education, it's really an area of education that focuses on the needs of gifted and talented students. And so we're going to take a little bit of time and look a little bit at the history, some of the models for dealing with gifted education, as well as some issues for working through this process. So what is gifted education? Really, it provides gifted and talented students an exceptional environment designed specifically for their social, their emotional, and their academic needs. Now, gifted students and gifted education can be traced back throughout education, but when we look at North America back in the 1800s, there were some schools in Massachusetts that opened particularly for gifted students. And one of the earliest ones being in Massachusetts in 1901. Research in psychology is also was really interested in looking at intelligence, and a lot of that research that happened at the beginning of the 20th century provided some new information and some new ways for measuring intelligence. And so people like Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon developed the intelligence quotient, what we call the IQ. And there they measured by comparing the mental age, which is the cognitive score on a test, and the actual age, with the mean being 100. And their research was really instrumental in the development of intelligence testing. Now, when we take a look at some of these people, let's take, for example, Louis Terman. He was born in 1877, lived to 1956, and he's really recognized as a father of gifted education. Back in 1916, Louis Terman revised that Binet-Simon scale and published what became known as the Stanford-Binet test. In fact, he only sold the rights to the test or Binet did for just a few dollars. And today, to buy the Stanford Binet test is, well over $1,000. Now, what makes it possible for schools to assess a student's intelligence is a test like the Stanford Binet test. Now, Terman was one of the first researchers to do a longitudinal study on gifted students, which began in 1921 and was continued by many other researchers, even following his death in 1956. Terman really published the first results of his research in 1925, and the reports that came out of this were that gifted students were stronger than the non-gifted students in many areas, physically, emotionally, and academically. There's a matriarch of gifted education as well, Lita Hollingworth. born in 1886, and she died in 1939. She obtained her PhD from and also taught at Columbia University in New York. And she was the first to use the term gifted for intellectually advanced children. In 1922, she taught a class for gifted students in New York City. She was also concerned about special needs of gifted children and wrote one of the first college textbooks on gifted education. And the title of it really kind of tells you a lot about what it's about. Her textbook was called Gifted Children, Their Nature and Their Nurture. It published in 1926. In 1936, she established a gifted school in New York for children ages 7 through to 9 years old. Gifted education really thrived in the early 1900s, resulting in many cities having schools for the gifted. However, through the Depression and World War II, interest became focused in other areas. But when science and science education came back in the 1950s and 60s, it really kind of sparked funding for support for the most talented students in math and science and education, in engineering. And that really resulted in in the United States, several acts that were intended to define what giftedness is and also ways to support the creativity, the leadership, and the academic ability of these children. And on the other side, there was also education acts enacted a little later on for those children that have different disabilities as well. For example, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975 in the United States. But there wasn't really, in some of those acts, there wasn't recognition of gifted learners. So in the United States, what became one of the most groundbreaking acts was the Jacob Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act. And that was passed in 1988 to support and provide resources for gifted programs. But it provided no uniform funding for gifted education. The act set up the National Research Center on the gifted and talented to provide a place for professionals in the field to conduct research and to inform other professionals. So at least there was a start with that kind of program. Now, there was many different models that have been applied to gifted education throughout the years. Models vary greatly from location to location, and few schools offer really self-contained gifted classrooms except in schools for the gifted. The most common gifted education models are accelerated enrichment and adaptation programs. So what is an acceleration program? An acceleration moves students through the school curriculum at their level. For example, a 4th grade student might attend a high school class for math. Academically, this meets the student's need, but there are concerns whether it is best for social and emotional development. Then there is enrichment activities. And these can be accomplished in the classroom by cluster grouping gifted students and providing them with supplemental independent projects. And this can be achieved by pull-out programs similar to those for special education students, in which students attend their gifted class for a few hours each week for enrichment. And then there's also adaptation programs, and that requires the teachers to individually adapt materials and their instruction for gifted students. This requires organization and time commitment from the teacher. Students also need a comfort level with their giftedness to prevent them from feeling uncomfortable with being different from other students. There are also several models that use a broader view of giftedness to help all students develop their talents. For example, school-wide enrichment models. Now, this is based on Joseph Renzulli's research on giftedness and uses a magnet school approach to develop talents of students. These programs have three goals: develop talent, provide a wide range of advanced level experiences for students, and provide follow-up opportunities in students' areas of interest. Now, Renzulli's three rings of giftedness suggest giftedness occurs only when three concepts come together: above average ability, above average task commitment, and above average creativity. Then there is the Accelerated Schools program project. And this is developed at Stanford University and replaces traditional teaching methods with enrichment programs for all students. And it's used in low-achieving schools where these programs have shown to raise the overall achievement of the school. And it takes 6 years for a school to transition to a full accelerated school. And this approach rejects identification of gifted students and builds on each individual student's strengths. Now, there's a lot of issues around giftedness. Funding, for example. Gifted and talented programs typically are not well funded. And so this can leave millions of students without appropriate education, arguably. When school principals are deciding between offering a class for low achievers to help them pass the standardized test or offering an advanced course for gifted students, principals usually choose to offer the class for the lower students instead of the advanced class. The availability, therefore, of gifted programs is going to vary significantly from school to school, from district to district, and from province and state to province and state. So, what is giftedness? Really, when we think of gifted, we can use Terman's definition, which is very, very narrow. And Terman viewed giftedness as only the top 1%. Renzulli defines it more broadly to include art and other activities. Even the use of the word gifted could be controversial, with some professionals really preferring the term high capability students. But the trend seems to be towards a broader definition, that it's more inclusive of the broad range of abilities beyond just narrow STEMs academic topics. There's also the issue of identification. How should students be identified for gifted programs? Sometimes schools traditionally have looked at IQ or school ability tests to identify students. Yet intelligence testing is known to have a cultural bias, and this is demonstrated by the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in student gifted programs. There is no standard for admission to gifted programs. So one school district might include 10% of their students, while another will only include 2 or 3%, which results in students qualifying in one place but not in another. And so identification is still based typically on the academic model rather than the broader definition. But identification can also be difficult because it may put off adolescent students who do not view giftedness as a desirable or popular trait. Overall, what we can see from all of this is that gifted education has grown from a very limited definition of what it means to be gifted to a broad idea about giftedness and about how to best meet the needs of gifted children. Now, all teachers want to give their students the best, most appropriate education. Your gifted learners have varied and really unique needs that require multifaceted gifted education to help them reach their full potential. To provide gifted learners with effective instruction, we must understand the rationale, the principles and goals behind gifted education. So, why gifted education? Your gifted students have characteristics that set them apart from average learners. Gifted students tend to learn at a very rapid pace. They're often highly creative and think in ways that are logical, abstract, and complex. The typical classroom frustrates these learners as they wait for their peers to catch up to them in a learning context. And these students require an educational program to suit their individual needs. Now, the benefits of gifted education really go beyond your classroom. Gifted students often have very lofty career goals, and they have the ability to achieve them. Gifted learners become doctors and scientists and artists and researchers and musicians. They really become the leaders in our community. So as they pursue their careers, gifted students become adults who can make important contributions to all of society. And perhaps the strongest argument for gifted education is that meeting the needs of our most capable students has a long-term positive effect upon our society. So there's some principles of gifted education. So we understand that gifted learners are distinct from their peers. Unfortunately, teachers are busy. And you often find yourself overlooking those children that are not struggling while you focus on the the students that are in need of remediation. You and your administration need to be mindful that all students have needs. And so there's a couple of key principles to keep in mind. Gifted students deserve the opportunity to fulfill their learning potential. And secondly, teachers need adequate training to provide an education that delivers this crucial opportunity. Now, one approach, and some will argue that it's somewhat controversial, one approach to gifted education is homogeneous ability grouping, which places grouped children with peers of similar ability. And many educators argue that non-gifted students gain from having gifted students in their classroom. However, the reality is that many gifted children do not reach their full potential when placed in a heterogeneous or diverse group. Having said that, I personally believe that there's an important place for the heterogeneous group work within any child's development and education. Now, if your school does not utilize ability grouping for gifted students, you may find yourself with a mixed ability classroom. That's more often what you will find. And sometimes there will be a gifted cluster or small group of gifted students in a non-gifted class. And what you can do with this small group is enable them to learn at a different pace. And as a teacher or educator, you can serve those gifted learners through small group instruction that challenges them specifically and helps them to move at their pace. Now, educators of gifted students need adequate preparation and training. They need adequate time to plan and to prepare. And because of the unique characteristics of gifted children, you should be trained to understand these characteristics, to identify gifted learners, and develop and differentiate a gifted curriculum. And this involves crafting tasks and being creative and challenging with questions so that you can challenge the learners and foster critical thinking skills. Overall, we want to be moving these students forward. And so there are some specific goals of gifted education. And the key goals of gifted education include, first of all, obviously identifying gifted students, but then also choosing strategies for serving them. So how do we go about identifying gifted learners? Early identification of giftedness is vital so that students receive the maximum educational benefit of gifted services. Schools without a system for identifying possibly gifted students risk wasting their potential. A major misconception is that giftedness equates to high classroom grades. In reality, no two gifted learners are alike. And the concept of giftedness has many facets. Your gifted learners may be particularly talented in one area, while they may not perform or are below grade level in other areas. Because giftedness varies so widely, an effective gifted program must establish a system for identifying gifted children. Often, you will find your school district or school system defines giftedness and provides various factors to consider for identification. These factors often include intelligence scores, achievement scores, academic grades, and creativity scales. And these are all good. But always be open to recognizing the beauty of the different kind of mind that each student brings to the equation. The goal of a multifaceted identification system is to consider the many ways a child may exhibit giftedness. The use of multiple indicators also increases the accurate recognition of low-income or minority gifted learners who are otherwise underrepresented in many gifted education programs. And further, using a whole battery of multiple indicators means that gifted students who have lower grades in some areas can be identified and receive appropriate instruction to further their giftings. So there's some certain best practices for your gifted students that you should give some thought to. First off, we've already mentioned some of these. Acceleration. So taking advanced classes or maybe even skipping grades. Compacting, which is simply pre-testing to bypass certain curriculum components that the student may already have mastered. You can also clustering. So you're grouping gifted students within a heterogeneous class and designing work that provides them with appropriate challenges. And then enrichment strategies, like deep exploration of a topic through specific tasks. They're not on the same level as their peers for different assignments. Not necessarily more work, but more in-depth work is really what we're going for with enrichment programs. So overall, gifted students become adults who positively impact society in a variety of fields, such as medicine, law, science, the arts, creativity, business. And for this reason, gifted education is important for society as well as to provide gifted learners an appropriate education to help them fulfill their potential. Proper teacher training is vital to a successful gifted education program. Goals of gifted education programs include identifying gifted learners and choosing strategies to differentiate instruction, such as ability grouping or creating clusters of gifted students within a heterogeneous class, and providing them with work that challenges them. There have been some laws that have been passed to ensure that gifted students gain an education. However, there has been, and it's something that we need to be mindful of, a tendency to favor the dominant community. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes our selection processes can be biased, and that we can find that minority groups are underrepresented within gifted programs. And so we need to be mindful of that as we move through the process of figuring out and recognizing all of these services.